This is question number 13 on homework 8 for chapter 10. So this is a real-time data analysis exercise. Go to the St. Louis Federal Reserve FRED database and find data on the number of commercial banks in the US in each of the following categories. Average assets less than $100 million. We have this symbol for this data. And average assets between 100 million and 300 million. And we have another symbol, average assets between 300 and 1 billion. And average assets between 1 billion and 15 billion. And finally, average assets greater than 15 billion. So obviously, these different data points are differentiated by the asset size of the banks. So the setup asks us to download the data into a spreadsheet. So we can first click the following link to view the average assets less than 100. So this is the first data among these different asset classes. So we just click on that. This will only give us this one data point, but we need multiple data points. What we can do is to edit this graph and add the other data points by copying and pasting their symbol. So the second one is the between 100 million and 300 million. So I just copy that symbol here, and you can see this is exactly what we want. So add data series, and so this way I have added this second data point. But my goal is to add all of those data points and download them to the Excel file. So I continue to do that for the rest of the variables. So the third one is right here, and also add this data and continue to do that for the fourth one. And finally, the largest asset class. Still use this add line function and this. So now we are done with this 5 variables, and then I can download. I choose download to Excel. So then when I open it, you can see that all these 5 variables are in this one sheet. So then we can continue our I'll continue the question. Calculate the percentage of banks in the smallest means it's less than $100 million, and largest, which means it's greater than $15 billion, categories as a percentage of the total number of banks for 1990 Q1. So we just look at the 1990 Q1. 1990 Q1 is right here, I guess. I highlight this in yellow. So it doesn't mention whether it's the end of the quarter or it's beginning of the quarter. I'm assuming this is beginning of the quarter. So then first I need to calculate the total number of banks. So this is simple. We just need to summarize, or we need to sum up all these, the number of the banks in all these categories. So starting from the smallest asset class and to the largest asset class. So this is the total number of commercial banks. And to calculate the percentage, So first, we need to do two calculations here. One is the percent of the smallest banks, and the other is the percent of the largest banks relative to the total number of banks. So here in column H here, I'm calculating the percent of the smallest banks. So that basically is this 9,529 divided by this total sum here. And for the largest banks, it's calculated similarly. So it's this 25 divided by the total number here. And then I just need to change the format to correspond to the rounding requirement. First, all this need to be in percentages. And it also asks us to round your responses to the 2 decimal places. So that's what I'm going to do here. So change the format and put this into the percentage terms and keep 2 decimal places. So now I can input this answer. Very large banks represented, so it's going to be 0.20%. And very small banks represented 76.45%. So check my answer here. Nice work. And then we are asked to calculate the percentage of banks in the smallest and the largest categories as a percentage of the total number of banks for the most recently available quarter, which is basically Q2 2020. So I guess what we can do is simply to pull the cell down all the way to the last row. The last row basically is the most recently available quarter. And that's also the reason why I believe I use Q1 to indicate the beginning of the quarter, because here the last one is actually the beginning of the second quarter, and that corresponds to the setup here. So now I can copy this number here. The first is the largest banks now represents 2.20% of all the banks, and smallest banks, you can see its proportion has decreased dramatically, right, over the last 30 years. See that? So now check my answer first. We are done. So the proportion of very large banks in the banking system has increased substantially. Yeah. So and that obviously has consequences, right? And that's the next part of this question. What has happened to the proportion of the very small banks? And that has decreased, right? Has shrunk dramatically. So then, because of the proportional increase in these very large banks, obviously the too big to fail problem has exacerbated, basically, right? Steadily worsened over this time, because we have so many large banks, and if something happens, something wrong happens, something bad happens to them, and then the government may have to bail them out. So that's the so-called too big to fail problem. And we have increasingly more of those banks, so this situation has steadily worsened over time. What does this say about moral hazard? And because of this too big to fail, banks have the incentive to take excessive risks, because if their risk taking turns out to be a failure, then the government, hence the taxpayers, will basically foot the bill, right? So that gives them more incentive to take the risks, and that's called moral hazard problem. And that obviously will increase, right? The increase in the number of very, very large banks can increase moral hazard in the banking system. Okay, so that's basically this question.